At 22 she had never been touched. But at midnight the most powerful man in New York told her, "Become my fiancé or watch your father die in a federal prison." Emily knelt on cold marble, before a desk of black glass high above Manhattan. The city burned below. Behind the desk Adrian Blackwood stood with hands resting on the edge, as if the skyline belonged to him. His calm was heavier than threat. On the wall screen above his shoulder the news replayed her father in handcuffs, surrounded by agents from the FBI and the SEC, cameras flashing. Emily's breath shook as she watched the loop of his arrest again and again. Her father, accountant to a shadow fund, was shoved into a car as questions rained down like stones. She wanted to scream that he was gentle, that he sang while cooking, that he once carried her home through snow the year her mother died. The memory cut her knees weaker. Adrian reached into a drawer and slid a small velvet box across the glass. It stopped inches from her shaking hands. Inside, a diamond caught the city light and divided it like ice in cold silence. 6 months, he said without raising his voice. Your body stays yours, but your life belongs to my name. The words pressed into her chest until it ached. Beyond the glass walls, traffic threaded the streets like veins, bright and indifferent to the ruin inside this room of her life. Emily tasted metal as she swallowed. She had never let anyone touch her, not out of pride but fear of losing what little control she owned in a hard city. Lucas had always walked her home with jokes and coffee, and a promise that the world would not take more than she gave. Now the city had taken her father and placed her on her knees before a king who did not need a crown. Adrian studied her with eyes that missed nothing, not the tremor in her arms, not the tear that slid down and fell soundless on stone. She reached forward and the ring burned cold against her skin as if it already claimed her. The pen waited beside the box. Her name on that page would rewrite every line of her life. She thought of her father alone in a cell, and the way he called her Emmy. Emily signed. The sound of the pen was small, but it ended everything she had been. Adrian closed the box and the city lights seemed to dim behind him. For the first time his mask cracked just enough to show a shadow of something like relief or regret. You will live where I place you, he said. You will be seen where I decide. And you will be touched by no one unless you choose it. The mercy in that last line unsettled her more than steel would have. Emily stood on unsteady legs as security opened a door that revealed the night and the waiting car. As she passed him, Adrian's voice dropped low and private. This does not end in a fairy tale, he said. It ends in survival. The elevator swallowed her and the floor fell away. On the ride down, she wrapped her arms around herself as if to hold what remained. The car slid into traffic, and New York closed around her like water. Messages exploded across her phone, but she did not answer. Her old life was already becoming rumor. Above them the tower returned to glass and distance. Behind its windows, Adrian watched until the tail lights vanished. He told himself this was a trade made of numbers, not hearts. Yet the image of her on her knees clung like ash. In the back seat, Emily pressed her forehead to the glass and felt the city rush past as if it meant nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The driver said nothing. Emily stared at her hands, as if they belonged to another woman. The ring weighed more than metal. It weighed 6 months of borrowed air, and the promise of a man who could bend courts and markets with a breath. She wondered which would suffocate her faster, fear or hope. Somewhere across the river, her father waited behind bars, counting the cost of a mistake he did not understand. Somewhere above the clouds, a man counted risk in billions, and had chosen her as collateral. The city moved on. It always did. That night she lost her freedom without losing her virginity yet. The car disappeared into the river of lights, and Emily closed her eyes as if darkness could return the girl who had entered that tower at midnight, believing fear was a small thing. It was not. Emily Carter's life before midnight had been made of small routines and quiet boundaries that kept the world at a safe, measured distance. Every morning she tied her hair back with the same faded ribbons slipped into borrowed sneakers, and crossed the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn toward the little corner cafe, where steam fogged the windows, and customers ordered confidence with caffeine. She was the girl who remembered names, who drew hearts in foam when no one asked, who carried sketchbooks between shifts, and filled napkins with charcoal dreams of galleries that had never heard of her. She was 22 and still a virgin, not because of belief or doctrine, but because touch felt like an unlocked door, and she had grown up learning that open doors let storms in. Lucas Blackwood met her at the counter most days, not as the heir he secretly was, but as the loud boy with questions and ink-stained fingers who covered politics for a living and pretended his job was only another way to chase trouble with words instead of fists. He waited until her break and walked her the long way past thrift stores and street vendors, as if distance itself could stretch safety a little further. To Emily, Lucas was the one, honest, constant, after her mother's death, the friend who taught her how to laugh without apology again, who never crossed the invisible line she guarded so fiercely. To Lucas, she was the one place in the city untouched by schemes and scandals and dollars soaked in bloodless wars he only half understood. Her father lived in a narrow apartment above a laundromat that never slept, and every night he counted machines the way others counted sheep, his hands trembling with a math the world had stopped respecting. He had once been good with numbers, the kind of good that made banks trust him with quiet work no one wanted to explain too clearly. After Emily's mother died from a sudden illness, he took the job that paid too well and asked too little. He told Emily it was temporary, and that money had no memory if you used it fast. Emily believed him because daughters believe first and question later. When the first official envelope arrived stamped with letters she did not understand, she hid it under a stack of grocery coupons and forgot it existed out of fear alone. The second envelope followed within weeks, heavier and colder, with language that spoke of audits and compliance, and questions that demanded answers she did not have. Her father folded his hands at the table and stared through the wall as if something on the other side waited for him. Still he smiled at her and said everything would be fine. In the city, fine was a word that often meant not yet. At school, Emily sat in back rows sketching models of hands she had never held, while her classmates spoke of internships in clean white buildings with names that sounded like gods. She sold one small painting through an online post and spent the money on new brushes she was too afraid to dirty. Her phone stayed light with messages from Lucas and heavy with the silence where her father's reassurance should have been. One evening after shift, she found him sitting alone in the dark kitchen with only the refrigerator glow cutting lines across his tired face. On the table lay a third envelope, this one from the SEC. He tried to explain the language and failed. Emily listened and heard only one truth beneath it all, that whatever he had touched now refused to let go. When Lucas learned about the letter, the color drained from his face in a way she had never seen before. He asked questions that made her stomach twist, and then he did something he had never done before. He told her not to worry, because his brother would know what to do. Emily had heard the name Adrian, only in fragments and always in lowered voices. The man who did not walk anywhere without the world moving to make space. The man whose companies rose and fell, like weather systems, and whose shadow touched everything Lucas wrote about, but never claimed directly. To Emily, he was only the older brother who rarely came home when Lucas spoke about childhood birthdays and summers that smelled like rain. She did not understand how a stranger who lived among glass towers could reach into a small apartment and pull a family back from the edge. Still, she nodded because fear had taught her obedience. The city did not pause while fate sharpened itself. Emily worked through steam and spilled milk, smiling through tremors she hid in her wrists. That night she dreamed of numbers chasing her through corridors that closed behind her with every step. The following afternoon, black cars waited at the curb when she left the cafe, and men in suits spoke her name as if it belonged to them already. Lucas arrived out of breath and pale, and told her only that she had to come. She asked where, and he said to Manhattan, and would not meet her eyes. In the back seat, as they crossed bridges that rose like teeth over black water, Emily pressed her sketchbook to her chest, and felt the city change temperature degree by degree. Towers replaced brick, silence replaced sirens. At the base of the building that pierced sky like a blade, Lucas stopped her with a hand on her arm, and his voice broke when he said, "Whatever happens next, I am still your friend." Emily nodded as if she understood friendship could survive the distance that money built. The elevator lifted them, but Lucas did not follow past the private doors. When they closed, she was alone with the reflection of a girl who looked like she still belonged to simple mornings and afternoons that smelled like coffee and rain. Minutes later, midnight would arrive, and the city would hand her to a man who owned consequence the way others owned time. She did not yet know the language of that exchange. She only knew that innocence felt like a small, warm room she was backing out of, with careful steps and no place left to set her foot. The ruthless city had been teaching her for years how things were taken. She was only just beginning to understand that sometimes what was claimed was not money but people. Adrian Blackwood learned control the year his mother died, because the world taught him that grief without power was merely noise. He was 19 when headlines devoured her name, when audit reports became public spectacle, and a woman who had balanced books for billion-dollar firms was reduced to a cautionary footnote in financial history. She did not survive the storm of questions, the strangers at her door, the camera lenses through their windows, the whispers that followed her through grocery aisles and church pews. One winter morning, she did not come down the stairs, and Adrian woke to a house that no longer breathed. From that day forward, he made a decision no one else heard: that no story would ever own him again. He would own the cities that stories were written in. By 38 he did. Manhattan bent subtly around the circuits of his companies, the servers housed under unmarked structures, the financial platforms that moved trillions without leaving fingerprints. Blackwood Holdings had its hands in payment systems, identity verification, predictive risk, banking software, and the nervous system that made modern money feel instant and invisible. Reporters called him the King of Manhattan because no market shock passed without his numbers adjusting it. Politicians shook his hand in hallways that pretended not to be hallways. Regulators spoke his name with the careful tone reserved for forces no one pretended to understand fully. And Adrian himself lived high above the city in glass corridors and rooms where silence was a design choice. He ate most nights alone, not because he lacked invitations, but because he hated the sound of people pretending. At dawn he read balance sheets the way monks once read scripture, searching for patterns that proved the world was still obeying something. The only person who entered his private office without announcement was Lucas, and even that was rare now. The brothers spoke less as years stretched and the gulf between journalism and billion-dollar secrecy widened. Adrian had watched Lucas choose truth in small packages while he chose results in overwhelming ones. When Lucas began to ask about the fund Emily's father handled, Adrian already knew the name. He had known it for months, tied as it was to Victor Hale, and a lattice of manipulations so intricate even the SEC had not yet named it properly. Victor did not deal in blood or bullets. He dealt in silence, adjusted margins, false volume, and clean theft so smooth, entire pensions vanished without triggering alarms. Adrian had crossed Victor before at a distance with regulatory pressure and controlled leaks, but Emily's father had stepped inside the engine room without realizing where he stood. When Lucas called that night, his voice carried the tremor of personal stakes, and Adrian felt something he had not allowed himself in years: proximity to consequence that was not abstract. He did not hesitate. He moved first. He delivered the data Victor believed no one had, and forced a federal arrest that would shift the narrative before Victor could redirect it. The price of that move was obvious from the start because Victor Hale never lost quietly. The girl would be the pivot. Adrian understood leverage when he saw it, and Emily Carter was leverage wrapped in innocence, fragile and perfect for pressure. He did not enjoy choosing her, but he chose her anyway because every system he built taught him that softness was only another variable. The board did not see that part of the equation, only the timing of the arrest and the neat turn in public sentiment. Adrian watched the news in real time while standing in his office that night, as Emily was brought up from the street by men who spoke gently as if gentleness changed intent. When she entered, he saw immediately that Lucas had not prepared her for the scale of the exchange that was about to happen. She looked small against glass that framed storms and towers, and the room that swallowed sound to make power feel larger. Adrian framed the offer in terms that were both precise and brutal, because vagueness only extended suffering. 6 months public fiancé, no physical claim on her body, no secrecy about the arrangement to her family, except what preserved him and her. In return, Victor would lose his shield, her father would live, and the fund would be dismantled without further reach for Emily. This was the cleanest version of a dirty trade. When she fell to her knees from shock and pressure, Adrian forced himself to remain still, because intervention would have been another form of ownership. Control required restraint as much as command. The ring had not been chosen for sentiment, but for message. It carried weight and clarity. The city would read it correctly. When she signed, he felt the old familiar closing of a circuit, inevitability locking into place. She would survive this because she had to. That was how the world worked for people like him, and for people like her when their lives collided with people like him. After the doors closed and the car left, Adrian did something he did not record for any quarterly review. He remained at the window long after the street emptied. He did not think about Victor or the DOJ or the share price adjustment that would ripple by morning. He thought about the way Emily Carter had held the pen, as if it were heavy with more than ink. He told himself that feeling was a residue of memory, the echo of his mother leaving a room that never fully warmed again. In the days that followed, Adrian moved with the accelerated silence of someone outrunning a threat he could not yet see. Victor Hale responded exactly as expected by shifting capital into new shells and quietly approaching media channels that thrived on reputations carved thin. Adrian countered with slow erosion of Victor's liquidity and quiet preparation of defensive narratives built on verified data. He did not touch Emily during that period beyond status updates delivered through private security. She existed in a column of risk until the narrative required her presence. When the gala approached, his advisors urged caution, but visibility was the point. Manhattan believed in proofs framed in velvet. The night of the event, Adrian stood before a mirror and adjusted cuffs with the same care others used for vows. He did not believe himself capable of owning hearts, and he did not intend to start now. Ownership required illusion, and the only illusion he allowed was order. Below, the city gathered, unaware that a story was about to be told into it that would change 3 lives and unsettle a 4th that thrived on ruin. From the height of his tower, Adrian Blackwood understood exactly what he was risking and exactly why it was necessary. Control demanded sacrifice. The only question he refused to ask was whose. Word count 1,200. Do you want me to write the next part? The morning after the arrest, the city changed its voice. Emily heard it in the tone of the radio host, who once joked about traffic and now spoke in clipped legal language. She heard it in the way the patrons at the cafe leaned closer to their phones, whispering as if a storm had moved under the surface of the streets. Her father's name was still not public, but the fund was, and people who had never met him were already deciding who he was, based on headlines that flattened men into cautions and warnings. Emily moved through her shift with practiced motions, her hands recalling foam and cups, while her mind replayed the image of him being pushed into the dark mouth of a government vehicle. Lucas did not come that morning, and the absence pressed on her chest harder than presence ever had. By noon, she was taken quietly from the back entrance and driven across bridges that no longer felt neutral. The Blackwood Tower rose without ceremony against clouds that looked too low for safety. Inside, men spoke into sleeves and women touched screens that answered without delay. She was guided into a conference room smaller than the office above but no less controlled. Adrian entered without introduction. There were no cameras now, only glass on one side and the city on the other as if witness enough. He did not sit. He placed a tablet on the table and turned it toward her. On the screen were lines of transactions branching like veins and names she did not recognize tied together by the thread of Victor Hale. Your father was arrested on evidence that would have held him for decades, he said. The narrative is simple and false. The deeper truth is that he was moved into position as a pressure point months ago. Emily's voice caught when she asked if her father would be released. Adrian looked at her as if the answer had weight, and he did not wish to tip it. He will not be released today, he said. He will remain in federal custody long enough for Victor Hale to believe leverage still exists. When the timing shifts, the charges will be reduced to cooperation, and your father will walk into witness protection under a name he will never choose himself. Emily felt the edges of the room soften as blood rushed through her ears. You gave him to them, she said. Adrian did not deny it. I placed him where the system could see him, he replied. That is not the same as giving him to Victor. The distinction sounded thin and cruel, but he let it stand. He slid another file across the table, this one thinner, bound in quiet authority. This is the public version of your future for 6 months, he said. Engagement announcements, interviews, controlled releases, charity appearances, all managed. Your education will continue under security. Your work will be supported discreetly. Your image will be weaponized and defended at the same time. Emily stared at the page and did not recognize the girl it described. She looked up at him with eyes that no longer hid fear. Why me? She asked. Adrian answered without embellishment. Because Victor will move against what he believes I value. He will believe I value you because I will make the city believe it. For a moment, Emily laughed without sound. You do not even know me, she said. Adrian's gaze did not move. Knowing is not required, he said. Presence is. She looked down at her hands, remembering the ring that burned cold in memory. When she did not answer, he reached into his pocket and placed that same velvet box on the table between them. This was the second time it had been offered, yet now it felt heavier. I do not need to touch what I claim, Adrian said evenly. The symbol is sufficient. Emily's breath shook. She opened the box and the diamond cut light into harsh lines across the room. It was not beautiful to her. It was clear. A contract in stone. If I refuse, she asked. Adrian folded his hands and told her the truth. Victor Hale will read refusal as confirmation that you matter to me, and he will act accordingly, he said. Which means your father will be held without protection, while the financial storm plays out around him. The system will not be gentle with him. The deal was simple and monstrous because simplicity left no place to hide. Emily closed the box without touching the ring. You traded my father's freedom for a stage, she said. Adrian did not flinch. I traded your father's life for time, he corrected. Emily stood suddenly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. For the first time, the room felt smaller than her anger. You talk like this is math, she said. Adrian met her movement with stillness. It is, he said, and so is your survival. For a breath, they faced one another across the glass table with the city watching but not seeing. Emily's shoulders lowered a fraction. The anger remained, but it gained a new shape. If I do this, she said quietly, you tell Lucas the truth. Adrian considered the name as if it were a chip, not yet counted. Lucas has already been told that the arrest is part of a broader case, he said. He does not know the price, because he would not accept the reasoning. Emily understood then that this deal had been designed to isolate her from every soft place she might fall. She picked up the ring at last, and it was colder than it had any right to be in a room full of light. Adrian watched as she slid it onto her finger, and the city seemed to accept it with a shift that existed only in the way her chest tightened. Outside, the first press release prepared itself. Inside, Adrian gave a single nod, as if acknowledging the seal of something older than either of them. The official announcement would go out within hours, with photographs taken in rooms where their bodies had never stood as a couple before. The world would be informed of a love it did not know how to question because money had sanctified it. That night, Lucas called Emily again and again until he could no longer deny the silence. When she finally answered, she told him only that she was engaged and safe. He did not believe the order of those words, and neither did she. The following day, her father was moved, and the charges were amended with a promise of testimony that offered keys he never knew he held. The city read the news as correction, not transaction. Emily returned to the penthouse where space was designed to impress but comfort was negotiated through absence. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, as light stitched the dark below, and tried to imagine 6 months as something measurable. In the mirror, the ring flashed with every small movement, and she learned quickly not to flinch at it. That evening, Adrian joined her in the long dining room, and for the first time they ate across from one another, not as strangers but as a story. He raised his glass not in celebration but acknowledgement. To the shape of things to come, he said. Emily lifted her water with hands that still shook. To the shape of things, she answered. Somewhere far below, Victor Hale felt the first subtle tightening in the net he did not yet see. The penthouse looked nothing like a home, and everything like a promise that could not be refused. Glass stretched from floor to ceiling without curtains, and the city pressed itself against every surface as if demanding entry. Emily learned the layout by walking it at night, when silence made the rooms feel larger, and the distance between furniture felt like the distance between choices she no longer had. She slept in a bedroom that smelled of nothing, and woke to light that had never touched her childhood walls. Adrian was rarely present in the mornings, and when he was, he spoke only of schedules and appearances, with the same neutral tone he used for markets. By the 4th day, a dress arrived, sealed in ivory paper, and a note that carried no signature but needed none. Gala tonight. The words were instruction, not invitation, and Emily sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, before opening the box, as if the act itself would move her closer to something she was not ready to face. The gown inside was gold without warmth, cut to claim attention rather than accent it, and when she held it up she saw how the city would see her before it ever learned her name. She dressed without music and let the stylist provided by Adrian turn her hair into something smooth and obedient to light. When she stood in the mirror, she recognized nothing but the ring, which had already begun to feel like a legend attached to her hand. Adrian waited in the outer room, dressed in black, with no ornamentation except the calm that no tailor could sew. For a brief second, when he looked at her, something changed in his eyes, too quick to name, and then it closed again. The car moved before she could speak, and the tower receded behind glass and steel, as if it had never belonged to anything human. The gala unfolded inside a banking hall that once processed transactions and now processed reputation. Names moved through air like currency, and Emily learned quickly that money had a sound when it laughed. Adrian's hand was placed at the small of her back, with mechanical precision, guiding her through clusters of guests, who leaned in to see her face before they saw her ring. Cameras lifted and fell with the practiced hunger of machines, and microphones caught fragments of questions, designed to cut without drawing blood. When the first flash caught her fully and the room seemed to tilt, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. A voice called out "Golden Virgin" and laughter rippled too fast to stop. Emily froze for half a breath, and in that instant the glamour cracked to show the weight beneath it. Adrian stepped forward before the next flash landed and placed his arm fully around her, blocking clean lines of sight with the simple authority of presence. His voice did not rise, and it did not need to, when he told the press that speculation was not a substitute for respect, and that the cameras would turn now. They did not turn all at once, but they did turn, and Emily realized in that moment what his protection meant, and what it cost. Inside the swirl of forced smiles and velvet voices, the humiliation lodged deep and hard, and refused to leave, even when the night moved on, and applause replaced whispers. Emily answered questions with the polite distance of a trained figure, and learned how easily rumor could be threaded into fact by repetition alone. Every touch she did not want was replaced by the sensation of being watched and weighed and exchanged. When Adrian leaned in to murmur instructions, his breath did not tremble, and she hated herself for noticing the steadiness of it. By the time the dessert course arrived, Emily felt the room had taken something it could not name and would never return. In the car afterward, her hands would not stop shaking, and Adrian accepted the silence without interruption until the bridge stretched above water that reflected the city into a second impossible depth. The penthouse swallowed them again, and when the doors closed, Emily pressed her back to the glass and let the breath she had held all night finally break. "They called me a thing in there," she said without turning. Adrian did not move closer. "They called you a narrative," he replied. "There is a difference." The logic did not soften the cut. She rolled the ring between her fingers as if testing the reality of it, and then she pulled it off. For a second it lay on the glass table between them, not as symbol but as question. Adrian watched it with an expression that belonged more to risk than to loss. "You do not have to endure that level of spectacle again," he said. Emily picked the ring up and slid it back onto her hand with a motion that ended the moment. "If I am to be seen," she said, "I will be seen standing." The following days confirmed that what had begun could not be unbegun. Images from the gala moved through feeds with tags that linked her name to his wealth, and to assumptions that became louder with each share. Students at her school looked at her differently, and some stopped speaking to her altogether as if proximity itself had become dangerous. Lucas called once and left a message that was half anger and half concern, and she did not answer because she could not yet find words that did not sound like betrayal. Adrian doubled security without discussion, and rerouted her schedule through controlled windows of visibility that felt like release and confinement in the same breath. At night she lay awake listening to elevators move through the building like the flow of blood, and tried to trace the version of herself that had once worried only about paint and rent. When she closed her eyes, she saw the word golden in the mouths of strangers, and learned that shame could be instrumented as efficiently as any algorithm. One afternoon, she returned from class to find a dozen flowers waiting in the antechamber, and no name attached to them. The color was wrong, and the gesture felt public even in a silent hall. Adrian had them removed without comment when she mentioned them, and the next morning the lobby was empty again and safer for it. In small ways, protection announced itself through absence, and Emily began to measure care by what did not happen as much as by what did. Yet the first humiliation had already etched itself into memory, and the city repeated it back to her in reflections that did not blink. At the end of the week, another envelope arrived, not from the SEC, but from a magazine requesting an exclusive that promised to celebrate her transformation, as if she had been a season. Adrian tore it once, and placed it in the waste without explanation. She did not thank him, and he did not expect it. They moved through the penthouse like parallel lines sharing air but not direction, and in the distance Victor Hale watched the data of public response, as if it were weather satisfying himself with the pressure he could already see building. Adrian Blackwood did not change his schedule when Emily entered his life in any meaningful way, and that was the first thing she noticed when she began to really observe him. He left before dawn most days, and returned long after the city had folded into quiet layers of light and shadow. The penthouse moved around his absence, as if it were a structure itself, and Emily found that silence had different textures depending on who it waited for. One evening she followed the sound of movement into the far dining room, and found him seated alone at the long table with a single plate placed exactly at the center, as if proportion mattered even when no one watched. He ate with precision, not hunger, and she realized he always ate that way. He lifted his eyes and did not seem surprised to see her standing at the edge of the room. "You should be asleep," he said, Emily stepped inside and for the first time did not stop at a distance. "I could not," she answered. He nodded once as if sleep were another variable that failed to perform on command. She sat 7 chairs away and the silence that settled between them was not tense but curious, like an unfinished question. After a moment he pushed a second plate toward the empty space to her left. She hesitated, then took the place without ceremony. They ate without speaking for several minutes until Emily broke the quiet with a simple observation. "You always eat alone." Adrian did not deny it. "I work better without ceremony," he replied. Emily studied his hands as he cut his food with exact angles, and she remembered the way those hands had moved the ring across glass without hesitation. "Why do you live like this?" she asked before she had time to reconsider. The question carried no accusation, only fact. Adrian set his fork down with care. "Because the world only behaves when it fears consequence," he said. "Ceremony invites error." Emily nodded slowly, as if this were knowledge she could file away next to everything else she did not choose but now carried. Days later she wandered the penthouse after midnight, unable to sleep again, and discovered a room she had never entered because it was never mentioned. It was neither office nor bedroom but something between, and the door opened at her touch. Inside were shelves not of books but of old vinyl records stacked with the care of something once handled often and now mostly remembered. There was a record player untouched by dust and a single chair near the window, where the city could be seen without being answered. Emily stood as though she had walked into a ghost, and when she turned, Adrian was there watching, not from the doorway but from memory. "My mother loved them," he said quietly. "She played them while she cooked." It was the longest sentence he had shared with her that did not carry instruction. Emily did not ask what happened to his mother, because grief had a way of answering without questions. Instead, she reached out and touched the sleeve of one album, with careful fingertips, as if music itself were something that could bruise. "You keep them because you miss her," she said. Adrian did not correct her. That night passed without ceremony or confession, but something shifted in the way the penthouse held its silence. In the days that followed, Emily began to notice the ways Adrian moved that did not belong to a monster or a king, but to a man accustomed to watching loss arrive on schedule. He left his door open when storms rolled in. He paused outside her studio space in the afternoons, without entering, as if standing at the threshold were itself a restraint. When she received notice from the university that her tuition for the next 2 semesters had been cleared in full without explanation, she confronted him at the dinner table. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. Adrian lifted his eyes from the screen near his plate. "I did not do it for credit," he replied. "Then why?" she pressed. "Because I do not like seeing precarity where I have already placed consequence," he said. It was not kindness as she understood it, but it was the nearest thing he allowed himself, and she learned to hear that language too. One evening, she received a call from a small gallery in Brooklyn that had once rejected her work with polite form letters. They wanted to show her 3 pieces the following month. When she asked how they found her, the woman on the phone hesitated and said only that her name had been passed discreetly. Emily did not need to ask who had passed it. When she confronted Adrian, he said nothing at first, then finally spoke with eyes that did not rise from his glass. "You should be seen for what you make, not for who you stand beside," he said. The words struck her harder than any compliment, because they implied a separation he was not required to protect. From that night forward, the shape of Adrian Blackwood began to change in Emily's mind, not in warmth but in dimension. She saw how often he stood between her and things he never named, and how rarely he placed himself in front of her for his own sake. During one late storm, the lights in the penthouse flickered and went out for only a moment, but long enough to draw memory into the room. Emily stood in the dark, breathing shallow, and Adrian moved from across the space without sound until his presence was near enough to be felt before it was heard. "It will return," he said, and it did, and she realized she had not known she was afraid until his voice replaced it. Later that night she asked him the question she had avoided since their contract sealed her days. "Do you ever regret what you do?" she asked. Adrian answered after a long interval in which the city inhaled loud outside glass. "Regret is a luxury I did not learn to afford," he said, "but there are nights when I revise the logic anyway." Emily considered that quietly. "You revise the logic with me," she said. Adrian did not look away. "With you the logic was already compromised," he replied. That answer unsettled her more than silence would have. In the weeks that followed, the public pressure did not ease, but the private distance between them thinned. They did not touch beyond accidental brushes that carried a charge neither named, but their conversations lengthened, and their silences softened into something that did not ache so sharply. Emily began to paint again at night, and once she found Adrian standing behind her without comment, watching color take shape where only canvas had been. He did not praise it and she did not ask, but the absence of dismissal was its own permission. Outside, the data war with Victor Hale intensified in invisible currents, and Adrian moved through meetings with the composed violence of a man, dismantling something bone by bone. Emily did not know the numbers, but she felt the tension in the air like electricity before lightning. One late evening she woke from sleep frightened by a sound she could not place, and found Adrian in the kitchen with his jacket still on his shoulders, and a glass in his hand untouched. The city was unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. For a moment neither spoke. Then Emily asked what he had lost tonight. Adrian looked at her and answered with a truth that surprised himself as much as her. "A piece of the past that insisted on defining me," he said. Emily stepped closer without invitation, and stood beside him at the window. The silence between them did not rebel. Somewhere beneath the monster people feared she saw the outline of the man who carried rooms and records and restraint like debts he intended to repay. She did not call him good, and she did not call him broken, but she could no longer pretend he was only a design of power. When she returned to her room that night, the penthouse felt marginally less like a cage, and slightly more like a shelter built on rules neither of them had yet fully named. The storm arrived without apology, just after midnight, rolling in from the river with winds that made the glass walls tremble, and the city lights blur into streaks of silver and white. Thunder folded over the towers in slow, heavy waves, and rain struck the penthouse like thrown gravel. Emily woke with a gasp as the power cut out, and the room was swallowed by sudden dark, so complete she could not see her own hands. For a moment she was 8 again, standing in a hallway without her mother, listening to the ambulance fade into distance. Her breath came too fast, and she wrapped her arms around herself as the silence between thunderclaps grew thicker than sound. She left her room without thinking, guided by lightning flashes that carved fleeting maps of the penthouse into her eyes. The air smelled of cold rain and ozone, and something burning faint and distant. She found Adrian in the library, where emergency lights glowed low like embers along the floor, and the fireplace had been lit by hand, casting restless shadows across shelves and record spines. He stood with his back to her, staring into the flames, as if they were memory made visible. When he heard her, he did not turn at first. "The storm does not bother you," she said, and even in the dark she could tell this was false by the way his shoulders held tension. He turned slowly, and the fire revealed a crack in the composure he wore like armor. "I learned early that storms do not wait for permission," he said. "Neither do fears," she whispered. Without asking, she crossed the room and sat on the rug near the hearth, close enough to feel the heat but far enough not to touch him. For a while they listened to the building breathe as wind pressed against steel and rain traced frantic paths down glass. In the rhythm between thunder, Emily found words she had not planned to release. "I signed my life away without knowing who I was giving it to," she said. Adrian watched the fire, not her. "You gave nothing that did not already stand in danger," he replied. "That is not the same thing," she said softly. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. After a long moment, Adrian spoke into the space between flames. "I was 20 when my mother died," he said. "The world decided she was expendable before I had learned the value of defiance. I promised myself I would never allow a narrative I could not dismantle to own anyone I cared about again." Emily looked at him then, and saw the boy beneath every calculation. "I did not choose you because you were weak," he added. "I chose you because Victor believes you are untouchable to me, and because the city needed to see that belief die publicly." It was the closest he came to apology, and Emily felt it land with the weight of truth. The fire shifted and sparks climbed like startled stars. She rose slowly and took the risk of standing in front of him, where the heat gathered strongest. "I am not a symbol," she said. He met her gaze at last. "I know," he answered. The storm intensified, and a roar of thunder shook dust from unseen beams. In the flicker of light, Emily saw the battle in him, not between good and evil, but between control and the ache of being seen by someone who did not want his empire, only his honesty. "Do you ever wonder who you would be without all this?" she asked, gesturing to the glass, and the height, and the night that bowed to his presence. Adrian's jaw tightened. "I stopped allowing myself that question because the answer might have made me human again," he said. Emily lifted her hand halfway, then let it fall, unsure of permission. The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow, and stripped years from his eyes. "I am human," she said quietly, "and you placed your fate beside mine, whether you meant to or not." Another thunderclap broke above them, and with it some last restraint he had fortified out of habit rather than will. When he stepped forward this time, she did not move back. His hands did not claim, they hovered as if learning the shape of proximity. "You should not choose this," he said. "Choice is all I have left," she replied. The kiss that followed was not an accident, and it was not rushed. It was careful, in the way dangerous things become when two people decide at once to stop pretending they are not reaching. His lips found hers with a question she answered by staying. The fire cracked and the storm raged and the world narrowed to breath and warmth, and the truth neither of them could any longer deny. When they separated, her forehead rested against his chest, and she felt the wild, ungoverned rhythm beneath the stillness he showed the world. "I have never been with anyone," she said into the space between his heartbeat and fear. Adrian's hand stilled as if nothing mattered more than the weight of her words. "Then nothing happens unless you ask for it," he said, and his voice held no edge at all, only gravity. Emily lifted her face and met his eyes without flinching. "Stay," she said. It was not command or surrender but consent shaped by trust built in fragments and firelight. He carried her not as possession but as care into the quiet of his room, where the storm softened against glass, and the city continued to burn below them, unaware of the small revolution unfolding in shadow and flame. Later, as rain eased and dawn pressed pale against the horizon, Emily lay wrapped in warmth not borrowed but chosen, and watched the man beside her sleep without armor for the first time. She did not feel owned, she felt answered. Outside, the storm passed, leaving the streets washed and raw, and inside the penthouse, something irrevocable had been given freely without contract or applause. The fire dimmed into embers, and the night released them back into a world that would soon demand costs neither yet wished to name. Morning did not erase what the storm had written into them, but it sharpened the consequences of it. Emily woke to pale winter light, sliding across glass, and the sound of the city returning to rhythm beneath the quiet of the penthouse. For a moment she forgot where she was and who lay beside her, and then memory settled with gentle weight, rather than panic. Adrian was already awake, watching the skyline with an expression she had never seen before, not guarded, and not distant but alert, in a way that suggested fear had found a place to stand. When he noticed her eyes open, he did not look away. "What happened last night does not change the contract," he said carefully. "It only changes us." Emily accepted the truth of that, without protest, because she had learned by now that love and safety did not always arrive together. By noon the feeds had moved from market fluctuations to speculation, and from speculation to accusation. Photographs from a private angle flooded the network's images of Adrian stepping out of a car with his coat placed around Emily's shoulders, shielding her face from cameras after an early morning court appearance for one of his companies. The picture said protection to some people and possession to others, and the second group shouted louder. Words like purchased and arranged and commodity spread with speed that felt clinical in its efficiency. Someone attached the phrase golden virgin again, and this time it moved without laughter, only hunger. Emily read the comments without blinking until Lucas took her phone from her hands and placed it face down on the table. "You do not owe strangers a witness to your life," he said, and his jaw tightened with helpless rage. He had come unannounced, accompanied by security he despised yet tolerated because Adrian insisted. The house felt smaller with three of them inside it, and the air carried the echo of three separate loyalties that did not yet know how to align. That afternoon, as Emily prepared to leave for class, Adrian joined her at the door with a coat already in his hands. "The cameras are waiting," he said, and draped it over her shoulders before she could respond. The coat smelled faintly of him, and something unfamiliar in her chest reacted before her mind could place it. Outside, the press surged forward, and Adrian moved in front of her with the practiced economy of a man who had faced far worse storms than voices. His arm came around her waist, not with urgency but assumption, and she felt at once protected and displayed. Questions flew that sharpened into accusations and then into narrative, as if repetition could make truth obsolete. "Did you sell your innocence for access?" she heard. "Did your father trade you as collateral?" someone else called, and the crowd leaned in at the sound of blood. Adrian did not answer them. He placed his body at the angle that blocked the worst lines of sight, and guided her through the chaos without breaking pace. The car door closed, and with it, the roar fell to dull thunder, but the shame followed her inside like a second skin. Inside the silence she broke. "They called me property," she said. Adrian did not soften his reply. "They call what they cannot control a thing because it comforts them to believe things can be owned." That night, Emily stood in the shower with water hot enough to sting, and tried to wash off questions that clung without substance. She pressed her hands against the tiled wall, and thought of the way Adrian had placed his coat around her, without hesitation, and wondered where protection ended, and claim began. The next weekend the magazine that Adrian had once torn returned with a cover story built without permission and anchored in speculation. On the cover, Emily's image was framed by his ring, and the headline framed her as acquisition, not person. The publication sold out within hours. Emily found herself recognized in public places now, not with awe but with assumptions that followed her into lines and doorways and trains like breaths she could not hold. When a man reached for her wrist in a bookstore and asked how much 6 months of access cost, Adrian appeared from nowhere and placed his hand between them with a calm so sharp it drew back the air. No one touched Emily again that night, but the witnesses carried the scene into rumor by morning and rumor into public mythology before the next dusk settled. Lucas argued with Adrian in the library where records still slept in neat rows. "You are turning her into a target," he said. Adrian did not deny it. "She was already a target," he replied. "The difference now is that the shots will not come from shadows." Emily listened from the doorway unseen, realizing that invisibility had been the last refuge she had lost without fully mourning it. A week later, the shrine that once served as their private refuge came under siege of its own. An anonymous story broke claiming Emily had been hired as part of a tailored narrative to soften Adrian's image, and that her father's arrest had been engineered to bind her publicly. The story mixed pieces of truth with poison until the shape became unrecognizable. Emily watched her father's name dragged into the light again and felt a panic that supplanted all others. She confronted Adrian in his office, where glass separated chaos from command. "You promised him safety," she said. Adrian rose from behind his desk and closed the distance between them. "I promised him survival," he answered, and his voice carried strain now where once there had been only control. "The difference is not academic anymore," she said. He did not dispute that. That night, when they stood on the balcony overlooking the river, the air was sharp with winter and scandal. "I cannot protect you from every interpretation," he said. "I can only choose to stand with you against them." Emily turned to him and understood at last the double edge of what he offered. Standing with him meant standing in the full field of fire. Standing apart meant losing the shield his shadow cast. The next humiliation arrived in a public forum where retreat was not possible. At a charity conference, a speaker implied Emily's presence as proof of commodified virtue in modern power dynamics, and the room leaned forward to savor the sentence as if it were theology rather than cruelty. Emily froze in her seat, feeling the weight of eyes as physical pressure. Before she could stand, Adrian was already moving. He crossed the distance between podium and audience and placed himself directly between Emily and the gaze that had carved her into an example. He did not raise his voice, but it carried through the space with the hard clarity of verdict. "You will not use her to decorate your argument," he said. "You will not strip her to build credibility. If you require spectacle, find it in your own reflection." The room dissolved into fractured noise, and the feed carried the confrontation into millions of hands within minutes. That night, commentary ranged from praise to condemnation in equal measure, and Emily learned that protection, when visible, became possession in the language of those who had none of either. Close friends pulled away, unsure how to reach her without risking exposure, and strangers pressed closer, as if danger were a currency she now circulated. In the quiet that followed, Adrian stood at the window and watched traffic nod and unwind, and for the first time, spoke without certainty. "They are closing in," he said. "Victor is testing where the seams hold." Emily approached him without ceremony. "And so are you," she answered. Adrian turned to her slowly, and for a moment, the accusation did not land as attack, but as revelation. The storm had taught them how quickly shelter blurred into confinement when eyes never turned away. Outside, the city set its gaze on Emily as if on a stage it believed she had chosen, and inside she learned how easily protection felt, like a second contract written in fear rather than ink. The scandal arrived without warning and without mercy, and it moved faster than any protection Adrian could deploy, because it was designed to look like truth. Emily discovered it in the worst possible way, through silence that felt wrong. Her phone did not ring that morning. Messages stopped midstream, as if a switch had been thrown. Even the campus that had grown used to whispered recognition passed her without comment, and that alone told her something had shifted beyond gossip into verdict. When she opened her feed, she saw herself reframed through a lens she did not control. The video was already everywhere, clipped and looped, and titled with words that assumed guilt rather than asked questions. It showed a woman who looked like her in a private room with a shadowed man whose voice was distorted but whose posture suggested money and power, and the implication was unmistakable. The caption read, "Exclusive contract proof exposed." Emily stared as if distance might make it dissolve. Every instinct in her rejected the image, yet the world had already accepted it with the appetite reserved for downfall. By the time she reached the penthouse, reporters lined the street 3 deep, and the words they shouted no longer asked who she was, but what she had charged. Inside, Adrian was already in motion, commands routed through secure channels, lawyers and analysts speaking in overlapping currents that formed a shield of sound she could not enter. When he saw her, his expression changed, not into softness but into something tighter and more personal. "Where were you this morning?" he asked. "In class," she replied, and the fact that she had no alibi strong enough to silence doubt landed between them like fracture. He did not accuse her, but the pause before his next words carried something that hurt more. "The video is deep fake," he said, "but the distribution pattern is personal. Someone inside our perimeter seeded it." Emily felt the weight of betrayal before she felt the weight of shame. Lucas arrived an hour later, his face pale in a way she had never seen, and he did not rush to embrace her. "Did you tell anyone about the contract?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Did you ever hint at wanting out?" he pressed. She remembered the balcony, the cold, the way she had named the second contract, forming in fear. "I said I was tired of being displayed," she answered. Lucas exhaled as if that were confirmation of something he had already decided. The looks he gave her were heavier than words, and for the first time, she felt the ground shift beneath the last friendship that had known her before towers and contracts and storms. Outside, the narrative built with terrifying efficiency. Screens replayed the clip beside photographs of her ring, beside articles about Adrian deals, beside language that slid from suggestion into sentence. Emily went ghost white, watching herself become an argument in rooms she had never entered. Sponsors withdrew from gallery interest, and the university issued a statement of review without explanation. By evening, even her father's name returned to feeds threaded now with the assumption that his crime had been payment rather than mistake. When she confronted Adrian again, his control finally cracked. "You should not have tested their lines," he said. Emily stared at him as if he had struck her. "I tested yours," she answered. The silence after that was not negotiable. He turned away and for the first time did not follow when she left the room. Later she found Lucas in the kitchen, and the look in his eyes was not curiosity but judgment. "Did you use my brother?" she asked. His hesitation was answer enough. When Adrian entered the space seconds later, the air sharpened immediately. "You think she fed this?" he said to Lucas. "I think she wanted out," Lucas replied, and the words hit harder than accusation, because they made motive where there had only been exhaustion. Emily felt something in her collapse that was not fear but a colder resignation. If the people who knew her best now read her through the story that had been written over her, then there was nowhere left to stand inside this house that would not echo with doubt. She removed the ring without drama and placed it on the counter where light cut it into sharp angles. "If you believe I traded myself for visibility," she said, "then keep the symbol that made it convenient to imagine." Adrian looked at the ring as if it were a weapon pointed at memory. "Do not do this," he said. Emily stepped back. "You already did," she replied. That night she left the penthouse without cameras, because scandal exhausts novelty as quickly as it inflames it. She took only her sketchbook and the coat that no longer smelled like shelter, and rode through the city in a car she did not recognize, because nothing in it belonged to her anymore. By morning, the feeds proclaimed the end of the contract, as if they had authored it, and the fall of the innocent, as if innocence had ever been allowed to exist in public without condition. Emily watched the headlines from a borrowed couch on the other side of the river, and read strangers discussing her worth in pieces of commentary that mistook volume for knowledge. Her name became a keyword that unlocked cruelty and entertainment in equal measure. Lucas texted once that night, and the message held only 3 words: "I tried to warn you." The words landed with finality. In the quiet that followed, the absence of Adrian's presence felt heavier than his shadow ever had. She realized that protection, when doubted, could turn into accusation faster than any lie could travel alone. The city did not pause for her grief. It consumed it as content and moved on to the next thing that promised collapse. By the 3rd day, sponsorships were gone, the gallery withdrew quietly, and her university froze her enrollment pending internal review. Emily Carter had become unmentionable in rooms that once borrowed her story for taste. She stood alone on the fire escape of an apartment that did not know her, and watched the morning fog curl through buildings like breath, and felt for the first time not owned and not protected, just erased in full view of millions. Down below, Victor Hale watched the data spike with satisfaction he did not allow himself to display. and in the penthouse, Adrian Blackwood stood before glass that no longer reflected a girl. Only the cost of having believed control could outrun intimacy. The offer came disguised as mercy 2 days after the scandal reached its peak, when Emily had learned how quickly a name could curdle in public air. It arrived through an anonymous email forwarded to her by a small arts nonprofit in Florida, offering a 3-month residency with no press, no contracts, and a private flight to ensure discretion. The language was gentle, almost apologetic, and it promised space from the echo chamber that had consumed her. Emily read it 3 times, and felt something close to relief for the first time since she left the penthouse. She did not tell Lucas because he had not called again, and she did not tell Adrian because silence had hardened into something that tasted like finality. The flight was scheduled from a private terminal used mostly by corporate travelers who valued distance over convenience, and the driver arrived exactly on time without conversation. The city receded behind tinted glass, and Emily told herself this was escape, not retreat. At the terminal, security felt perfunctory, like ritual without belief, and the crew spoke her name with a careful neutrality that neither comforted nor warned. As the plane lifted, she watched the grid of streets dissolve into abstraction, and allowed herself the smallest belief that anonymity might still exist somewhere south of scandal. The descent came too fast and into a place that did not match the coordinates she had been given. The airstrip was surrounded by scrub and hangars that stood too far apart for sound to carry easily. When the door opened, no nonprofit representative waited, only a man in a dark jacket with his hands hidden and his smile designed to reassure rather than convince. Emily stepped down the narrow stairs and felt the wrongness of the scene settle into her skin before any word confirmed it. The second man appeared behind her, and the world tightened violently without warning. Her sketchbook fell first, then her balance, and the grass rushed up in a blur as a hand pressed into her back. She did not scream because breath had already been taken from her. The last thing she saw was sky splitting cleanly into white above her before darkness closed. When Emily woke, light burned across her eyes and pain stitched through her limbs in bright small lines that refused coherence. She lay on a metal table in a warehouse that smelled of oil and sea rot, and iron that had learned corrosion by degrees. Her wrists were bound above her head, and a low, steady hum of machinery vibrated beneath the floor like a living thing. A figure sat in a chair just beyond direct light, and the voice that reached her was smooth enough to be mistaken for kindness. "You should not have left the city alone, Miss Carter," Victor Hale said. Emily closed her eyes once and reopened them slowly. "You should not have touched me," she answered, and the strength in her voice surprised even her. Victor rose into the light with a smile that belonged to men who liked to refine pressure through patience. "You were never untouchable," he replied. "You were simply inconvenient until the story shifted." He gestured and a screen descended beside her, showing Adrian in a secure room with agents she did not recognize standing at deliberate distance. The image was live and unguarded. "He is choosing whether you leave this room alive," Victor continued. Emily felt the ground tilt, not from fear for herself, but from the weight of his claim. Victor explained with the pleasure of a man who enjoyed describing machines how Adrian had been presented with a transfer of financial data, so vast it could cripple markets if released publicly or lock Victor Empire away behind sealed indictments if retained. "Exchange the data," Victor said, "and Emily disappears to a life that will never reach your feeds again. Refuse and she becomes a warning you did not prevent." Emily stared at the image of Adrian where the city could not reach him, and for the first time since the storm she prayed not for rescue but for his clarity. In the secure room, Adrian watched the data lines stack and unstack as if the world were breathing through servers. Victor's voice came through the channel unfiltered. "You taught me to respect leverage," he said. "Now show me if you are willing to be defined by it." The agents waited for Adrian's decision as if the future were a switch that could be flipped by a single gesture. He thought of the night fire wrote new truth between him and Emily, and of the morning the story tore it open again. He thought of her standing unmade by rumor, and of his own hesitation that had given doubt the time it needed to bloom. Without flourish, he spoke to the console. "Release the files," he said, and the room reacted before the words finished rippling through air. Miles away in the warehouse, Victor felt the shift not as sound but as a sudden vacuum where confidence had lived. "You would burn your empire for a girl?" the man asked, disbelieving. Adrian's voice cut through the channel with quiet finality. "I would dismantle a lie for a truth I have already violated," he said. The restraints at Emily's wrists unlocked with soft clicks that sounded louder than any alarm. Chaos did not erupt yet, because men trained for power move slowly when certainty has been stolen from them. Victor lunged forward with a firearm that had no place in hands accustomed to influence rather than threat. A second shot echoed through the metal vault of the space, and Victor fell without dignity into the red shape of his last decision. Men scattered in directions they could not name, and Emily dropped from the table onto unsteady feet and ran because instinct does not negotiate when chains fall away. She burst into light that was too clean for pain and too wide for doubt, and skidded into arms that closed around her with force that was not ownership but proof. Adrian's breath was ragged and real against her hair, and she felt his hands shake where they held her, as if control had finally failed him and survival had taken over. "I am here," he said into her hair, as if the words needed to be anchored in sound. Emily clung to him without apology because this was not surrender but return from edges she now knew had names. Sirens rose in the distance as agencies closed in on a war that had ended without spectacle, and Adrian release detonated through Victor ecosystem with surgical speed. By dawn, the markets reeled, and the feeds that once devoured Emily turned their attention to the sudden collapse of a man they had never fully seen. In the aftermath, Emily sat alone with Adrian in the back of a car that no longer moved through glamour but through consequence. He did not reach for her until the city skyline returned as gray horizon, and then his hand covered hers without symbol and without claim. "I chose you without protection of numbers," he said. Emily met his eyes without fear. "Next time," she answered, "choose me with truth first." Adrian nodded once, and in that small motion the billionaire who owned Manhattan accepted the only loss that had ever cut deeply enough to be earned. The war that followed did not stain streets with blood, but it rewrote balance sheets, courts, and names with a violence that lasted far longer than any gunfight. By the time the public learned that Victor Hale was under federal arrest, his digital empire had already locked itself into evidence and surrendered its skeleton to agencies that had waited years for a single structural failure. The markets convulsed with the kind of shock that only hidden systems can produce when they are suddenly dragged into daylight. Funds collapsed overnight. Pension safeguards froze, and anonymous money that had shaped elections and housing markets alike lost its shelter in hours. News anchors spoke of an invisible war finally breaking the surface, and Emily watched it unfold from a quiet hospital room where the world felt distant and painfully real at once. She had bruises where wrists had been bound, and exhaustion that pressed into her bones like winter, but she was alive, and with every breath she felt the cost of that truth settle more deeply than fear ever had. Adrian did not leave her side except when agents required statements, and even then, he stood in the doorway as if presence itself were a vow he could not yet speak. When the cameras finally reached the story, they framed it first as corporate catastrophe, and only later as personal reckoning, and the shift in narrative changed nothing for Emily at first, because shame does not dissolve just because the machinery that forged it breaks down. The deep fake was dismantled, line by line, in public forums by experts who explained to viewers how easily images could be taught to lie, and how efficiently lies could be trained to feel personal. The source code pointed with quiet inevitability back to Victor Hale's own infrastructure, and the distribution trails revealed a campaign that had been seeded with algorithmic precision to coincide with moments of maximum vulnerability. The truth arrived into a world already tired of believing anything, and Emily learned that vindication did not reverse damage, it only changed silence into a different sound. Galleries that had closed their doors called with apologies framed as invitations, and the university restored her enrollment with a statement that avoided the word innocence, as if it were liability rather than fact. Lucas came to the hospital 3 days after the arrest, and stood at the foot of the bed with hands that shook in a way she had never seen before. "I was wrong," he said, because there were no other words that could hold the space between them. Emily looked at him, and felt the ache of everything that had been held back too long. "You were afraid," she replied, and the truth in that sentence softened the weight of his error without erasing it. When she turned her head, Adrian was standing quietly near the wall, as if he did not yet know how to enter forgiveness. Lucas' gaze moved to his brother, and the air tightened again with histories that did not want to be folded into present without resistance. "You let her go into that storm alone," Lucas said, and his voice carried accusation without volume. Adrian did not deny it. "I believed distance would shield her," he replied. "It became the breach." The silence that followed was not reconciled, but it was honest, and honesty made space for things that had no room to breathe before. The press demanded Adrian's presence when the scope of his choice became public, and for the first time in his career he did not send representatives ahead of him. He stood before cameras that had once waited for his approval and spoke without calculation. I dismantled my own holdings to release evidence that could not coexist with the economy we pretended was clean, he said. I accept the loss as consequence, not martyrdom. When asked if he regretted the collapse of an empire built over decades, he answered with eyes that did not look for approval. Empires that survive on silence deserve collapse, he said. When asked if he had done it for a woman, he did not deny it either. I did it because I denied her truth once, and it almost killed her. The statement hung in the room as if no one had expected ownership of fault to sound so plain. The board removed him from executive control within 24 hours as protocol demanded, and Adrian signed the separation without protest, because he had already paid in currency that obeyed no market. In the weeks that followed, Emily lived between recovery and return in a rhythm that did not seek to hurry itself. She painted again with hands that shook less with each session, and found that what emerged on canvas did not carry shame but power reclaimed from threat. When Adrian joined her in the quiet of her new studio space rented under a name no one recognized, he moved without the stiffness he once wore like second skin. I no longer own a city, he said, as if reporting weather. Emily did not look up from her work. You were never meant to, she replied. The absence of his old authority hung between them like a third presence neither mourned. The trial moved through proceedings that felt endless to those outside, and surgical to those inside. Victor Hale did not plead innocence. He attempted leverage even in chains and found none responsive. When he was finally sentenced, the feeds treated it as epilogue rather than climax, because the story the public consumed most hungrily was not the fall of an unseen architect, but the renunciation of a visible king. Adrian's loss made headlines that framed collapse as romance and redemption as spectacle, and Emily rejected the language without needing to argue it. Redemption does not arrive with applause, she said to him one evening, as they stood on the edge of a river that no longer looked like boundary. It arrives when you stop performing for ghosts. Adrian nodded, and for the first time she felt he understood the sentence without trying to refine it. 1 month later, the courtroom cleared after the final ruling, and Adrian remained seated long after others left, as if staying were instruction rather than habit. Emily waited outside, and when he joined her, he did not speak at first. I no longer have the right to place rules on your life, he said eventually. I would like the chance to ask for it instead. Emily studied him in the light that made no distinction between wealth and want, and saw neither monster nor king but a man who had chosen last to become visible without guarantees. I do not want to be owned, she said. Adrian answered without defense. I want to be chosen, he replied. The distance between the statements was not an argument but a bridge they could decide to cross together or not cross at all. The following days carried quiet adjustments rather than declarations. Emily moved into a small apartment near the river, with windows that opened by choice and noise that belonged to living rather than performance. Adrian took a consulting role with a nonprofit that rebuilt financial access in communities gutted by the kinds of manipulations he once refined, and his presence there did not resemble penance. It resembled responsibility learned late, but not refused. The scandal that had destroyed Emily's name lost its grip, as new narratives demanded attention, and she learned the strange truth that the world forgets more easily than it forgives. Yet she did not need either as much as she needed the knowledge that what had been taken by force had been reclaimed by choice. One evening, as they walked without security for the first time in months, Emily stopped beneath a streetlight and turned to Adrian. I do not know what we become now, she said. Adrian did not reach for her hand. Neither do I, he answered. But this time we build without contracts. Emily smiled not with triumph but with relief earned through survival rather than spectacle. And for the first time, the future did not feel like a cost that needed prediction, only a horizon that allowed uncertainty to exist without threat. 1 year passed without ceremony, and yet everything had changed in ways Emily could measure by breath, rather than by headlines. She woke each morning to river light, slipping through unguarded windows, and the sound of ordinary traffic that belonged to no one empire. Her studio occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse, where paint dried slowly, and ideas moved quickly without permission from capital. Adrian arrived on foot when he came at all, carrying coffee instead of security, and listening more than he spoke. The world still whispered his name, but it no longer bent around it today. Emily's exhibition opened in late spring, not as comeback but as quiet arrival of work that had learned to stand without defense. The gallery was small and honest, and the crowd moved with curiosity rather than hunger. Lucas stood near the doorway arguing with a critic who missed the point, and her father stood beside a woman who held his hand with recovered steadiness. Adrian remained in the back until Emily's glance found him, and then he smiled with a pride that asked nothing. No cameras pushed inside, and no contracts waited behind the walls that night at all anymore. After the show, they walked along the river where summer gathered in warm bands across the water, and the city pretended nothing ever fell apart. Lucas teased Emily about selling out, and she laughed and told him she sold in because for the first time, the words felt true. Her father watched them with the careful joy of a man who had learned how close ruin lives to gratitude. Adrian lingered a step behind until Emily's hand found his and drew him forward, without looking back into the soft crowd that drifted past them, with open faces and unbroken evenings. The ring that once named a sentence now slept in a drawer beside ticket stubs and dried paint, as if time had rewritten its grammar. Adrian never wore anything that signaled promise, and Emily never asked him to. They spoke instead in hours shared in kitchens that argued with morning, and in late debates about whether markets could ever be taught empathy. He no longer spoke in inevitabilities, and she no longer listened for permission. Outside, the world continued to mistake their quiet for absence, and yet every small action contradicted the assumption with patient proof of return and becoming. Adrian consulting work kept him moving through neighborhoods that money once treated as rounding error, and he learned the unfamiliar discipline of explaining instead of commanding. When clients thanked him, he corrected them and pointed to the teams who now decided pace and terms. Emily painted faces drawn from these streets not as symbols but as presences that demanded attention without asking. Their nights were spent with open windows and shared meals, where choices felt light, because they were chosen, not purchased, not coerced, not rescued, but grown from days that refused to be traded again for spectacle or fear. One evening in early autumn, they stood on the edge of the river, with the bridge lights braided into gold, and Adrian reached into his coat and produced no velvet, no metal, only a folded paper. It was the deed to a small building he had transferred into a community trust in Emily, father name as restitution that asked no forgiveness. Emily read it twice, and then closed it without ceremony. "This is enough," she said, and for once that word needed no defense, because it did not measure worth, only direction, and sometimes direction is the only proof we ever. The wedding was not announced, and therefore it arrived without commentary on a quiet morning when fog softened the city into suggestion. They married at the courthouse with Lucas as witness, and Emily's father steady at her side, and no reporters at the doors, because no one had been invited to watch memory form. There was no contract ring, only breath held and released between two people who had learned the cost of spectacle. When they stepped outside, the fog lifted as if on cue, and the day opened without demands, or terms written in public ink that fades badly. They celebrated with coffee from the same corner cafe where Emily once learned the patience of steam and cups, and the art of being overlooked. The barista recognized her and smiled without excess, and that ordinary kindness felt richer than any champagne ever had. Adrian laughed at a crooked joke, and Lucas shook his head and called them both impossible. The city moved around them with the same indifference it always had, and that indifference now felt like permission to exist without performance, to be unknown by strangers who once believed they had a claim on her name and story. In the months that followed, Adrian never returned to the towers that once defined him except as visitor, and even then he moved as if the air no longer belonged to him. Emily traveled with her work to cities that did not care about old scandals, and found that anonymity could be learned again like a second language. They argued about ordinary things, rent temperatures, late trains, and learned that conflict without threat is a different craft altogether. Nothing about their life invited spectacle, and that privacy felt like a newly discovered right that had been delayed by fear noise. On the anniversary of the trial verdict, Emily returned to the fire escape where she had once watched her own erasure move through morning air, and this time, she watched the river instead. Adrian joined her without asking, and they stood in silence that did not ache. "I thought forgiveness would feel louder," she said. "It feels like space," he answered. They did not speak of victor or courts or collapse, because those chapters had already surrendered their power to ordinary days that arrived without announcement, and left traces only in the steadiness of breath and the patience of hands. When Emily opened her next exhibition a year later, the catalog listed her simply as Emily, without surname, without origin story, and without apology. Critics wrote about color and line instead of trauma, and she let their words pass without needing to correct them. Adrian attended with a quiet pride that did not look for reflection, and when asked who he was, he answered only that he worked nearby. The truth fit easily inside that sentence now, as if identity could finally rest without being anchored to collapse or ownership, or the machinery of judgment that once defined them both. If this story touched you, let that feeling stay with. Emily's journey reflects many silent battles hidden behind screens today. Adrian's downfall and rise shows power cannot replace conscience ever. If you felt anger, sadness, or hope, then listen closer. Every choice made in fear carries consequences into tomorrow always. Every choice made in courage reshapes the future slowly forward. Love in this story was not perfect but persistent anyway. Trust was broken, rebuilt, and tested under unbearable pressure repeatedly. If you connected with Emily's strength, comment with a heart. If Adrian's struggle made you think, comment with fire below. Your reactions help this channel grow and reach others too. Stories live only when they are shared and discussed openly. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please like the video. Each like tells the algorithm this story mattered today deeply. If you are new here, consider subscribing now for more. New stories arrive weekly filled with romance, struggle, and hope. Your support allows us to keep crafting deeper narratives consistently. Tell us where you are watching from in comments today. We read your messages and they truly guide future stories. Which moment moved you the most in this episode, and was it the storm, the betrayal, or the redemption moment? Share your thoughts because your voice shapes this community together. If you believe Emily deserved her second chance, say yes. If you believe Adrian truly changed, say yes as well. If you think love redeems even broken power, say yes. If you would have walked away earlier, tell us honestly. There are no wrong answers, only different hearts speaking here. This channel exists for emotional connection, not empty spectacle alone. Every viewer becomes part of the story by feeling it. Thank you for staying through every chapter of pain and growth. Often begins exactly where comfort ends suddenly for you. If this story gave you courage, hold on to it tightly. Someone else may need that courage tomorrow more than ever. Share this video with anyone who needs hope right now. You never know which story might save someone someday else. Hard seasons do not cancel the future, they reshape it. Emily learned that innocence can turn into strength through choice. Adrian learned power means nothing without accountability or truth ever. Together they learned love must be freely chosen every day. Their ending was not perfect, but it was honest enough. Let honesty be the lesson you take forward from this. If you want more stories like this, comment more below. Your engagement decides which worlds we build next together here. We listen carefully because this channel grows with you always. Thank you for trusting us with your emotion and time. Stories like this survive only through shared attention and belief. Your belief turns fiction into something that feels real again. If you felt this story fully, leave a comment below. We will be there reading and responding to you personally. Your words matter more than you may realize right now. Until the next story, take care of your heart tonight. Protect what is gentle inside you at all costs, always. Love rarely arrives clean, but it arrives honest, eventually true. Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing again after pain fades. Thank you for staying until the very end. We see this channel exists because you choose to be here today. More chapters, more love, and more healing are coming soon. Stay with us as these stories continue to grow together. Until next time, keep believing in second chances for yourself. We will meet you again in the next story soon.